begin. And if it's fine by you, we're going to record this and put this up on the website. I think you already said okay for that. So
yeah, fine. That's super cool. I was also happy to read this because I missed the last sessions, unfortunately. But
no worries. Yeah,
schedule is like in my calendar. Yeah, I was
of
very
course.
sorry to see this. Like, I thought there would be some kind of reminder, and then I noticed, oh, there is a reminder, but I didn't properly sign up. So, yeah, that
No
was.
problem. No worries, no worries. We're here now, and yeah, very excited to hear about your tram model. And I obviously came across it. I read the work and very interesting, and I thought this was a cool uh, thing to share with the broader community as well. So very nice.
Yeah,
Uh,
thank you very much for the opportunity. That's very cool. Also, yeah.
Of
I
course, yeah.
also congratulations to your workshops on Kai, and I saw your post uh, yesterday. I guess
Oh
it,
yeah,
yeah, that
right. No,
was
thank you.
great.
Are you going to be at Kai as well?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay. Well, definitely, I'm sure our paths will cross at some point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
hopefully.
Working on these similar topics, it's a matter of when, then not, and not if, right?
Yes, right. Yeah.
Okay. Shran, so shall we let people in?
yeah, I'm doing that.
Okay, thanks. Hello, Leon. And will you keep an eye on also starting the recording, Shran, or do you want me to?
I can start once you're all ready. And
Okay. Yeah, let's give it another minute and then I guess we can get started. And while we wait for others to jump in, Nadine, I also had the pleasure of bumping into Marcus Lange at a dog stool recently. And
Yeah. Yes.
yes,
So you are cooperating on the AI chaos.
yes,
Was it that one? Yes.
yes,
Nice.
yes, yes. Indeed, yeah. And I learned you worked with Marcus. And did you also work with Kevin? Kevin
Yes,
Baum?
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
They are both co-authors of this.
Oh, Kevin's also on this. I didn't pay
Yes,
attention to
right.
that. Okay.
Yes.
I see. Got it. Got it.
And
It's a
Mark is
small
my
world.
supervisor.
Oh, Marcus is a supervisor.
Yes, right.
Okay, cool, cool, cool. Oh, that's nice. Okay, very
Yeah.
cool. Nice.
Yeah.
I can now imagine some fun conversations with you and Marcus sitting on in the lab, and yeah,
Yeah.
nice.
Yes, we had some intense conversations also with Kevin.
Oh yeah, with Kevin involved, of course, there will be some intensity in the discussion.
Yes, that was quite good.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. I mean,
challenge on that one, quite early in
yes,
the process.
very nice. Yeah, I mean, when there's passion that comes to the fore with research, it gets more exciting.
Definitely, yeah.
So
Also,
that's
like
nice.
interdisciplinary work is helpful in this regard, even if it's like sometimes exhausting also, but it's worth the effort,
Yes,
I think.
no doubt. Completely agree. All right. Maybe it's a good time to start the recording and I can jump into the intro. Sure. All right. Good day, everyone. I'm Ujjwal Gadaraju. I'm an associate professor working on human-centered AI at the computer science faculty here at TU Delft, together with Shreyan Biswas, who's here with us in the room, who's a PhD candidate I have the pleasure of advising. We would love to welcome all of you to this edition of TAF. The Academic Fringe Festival, of course, is an exciting concoction of invited talks and oral discussions, panel discussions around important research and innovation themes in computer science. And in this particular fifth edition, we're focusing on trust in the times of generative AI. We're looking at planning, reasoning, and collaborating with AI. Now, this particular series features prominent researchers and practitioners whose work has made a number of interesting, meaningful contributions to these fields. We've had excellent talks already to get this edition going from the likes of Jana Buccina, who spoke to us about worker-centric AI. We had Anna Kawakami, who spoke to us on designing positive AI futures for socially complex work with and for workers, as she called it. Adita Boguka, who spoke about visual tools for understanding AI's impacts. And then we had Harmanpreet Kaur, who spoke about cognitive scaffolding in this age of AI. And most recently, we had JC Rees-Antis, who discussed HCI and the role HCI has to play in this transformative age of AI. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome the wonderful Nadine Schlicker, who will share conceptual insights for trust and for trust research in general by presenting the trustworthiness assessment model. Nadine is a psychologist who's specializing in human-centered design and trustworthy AI. She's a PhD candidate at the Institute for AI in Medicine at Marburg University. And with experience across academia and industry in usability and user experience research, her work focuses on how users assess AI trustworthiness in medical contexts. Her interdisciplinary research, something we were just talking about before jumping in here, bridges human factors, HCI, medicine, and engineering psychology. She collaborates with experts from computer science, philosophy, psychology, and medicine to explore how AI can support clinical decision-making and enhance the well-being of healthcare professionals and patients. Nadine, it's great to have you at the Academic Fringe Festival. Please take it away.
Thank you, Joel, for the great and nice presentation and introduction of myself. So it's a pleasure for me to be here and have the opportunity to present my work, which is basically concerned with trustworthiness assessments. And I think I can skip my introduction because there's nothing to add. So as already said, I'm mostly in the department of in the Institute for AI in Medicine, and trust is a very important aspect of medicine, as it is an important predictor of treatment success, of patient compliance, and also for the continuity of care. So, like 3 years ago or 2 years ago, AI raised expectations that it could take over aspects of medical treatment. And trust in AI was prominently discussed in scientific and also public discourses. And these discussions often tackled one specific aspect, like the aspect of trust and trustworthiness. So the question was, is AI trustworthy? And to increase AI trustworthiness, multiple institutions tried or defined guidelines and principles and standards for trustworthy AI. And the term trustworthiness could be found in various forms of ethics guidelines, here from the European Commission, also in the international cooperation principles from the OECD for trustworthy AI, and also in some national standardization guidelines. You could find AI trust in the center, or also AI trustworthiness. But it seemed to me that this is not like the solution we are looking for, so at least not at complete. So as a psychologist, I started asking, what leads people to trusting AI? So we looked at existing models of trust and trustworthiness, like for instance here the organizational trust model by Meyer and colleagues, but also similar models from Lee and C. And they all start at the point where trusters already have built their perceived trustworthiness of a system. And this perception then translates to trust as an attitude or an intention, and then to any kind of trusting behavior. But the question that was still open is how we reach this perception of trustworthiness. And that was exactly the question we tried to answer in this paper, which I co-authored with colleagues from philosophy, from design, from computer science, and also other colleagues from psychology and medicine. So we tried to answer how we reach this perception of trustworthiness. And the trustworthiness assessment model kind of tried to add the system to existing trust models. And the first proposition of the trustworthiness assessment model, so short, is TRUM, and I think I will go with this abbreviation. So trustworthiness is a latent construct. So basically, I think we can agree that it's not observable, directly observable. So you cannot just directly measure trust. And as such, trusters need to use observable cues to infer the actual trustworthiness of a system, which then leads to their perceived trustworthiness of a system. And on the system side, like the accuracy of this assessment from an actual to perceived trustworthiness, this depends on the system side on the relevance and availability of cues. So relevance here means that how indicative is a cue for the actual trustworthiness of a system. And for instance, if you take an interface of ChatGPT, you see that there is a cue that, so in the 2022 version, it says that ChatGPT may produce inaccurate information about people, places, or facts. And this is a cue, but it's not very specific. So when we get an output, we do not know whether we could rely on this specific outcome or not. But of course, on the truster side, there's also factors influencing the accuracy of the trustworthiness assessment. And this is the detection and correct utilization or interpretation of the cues on the side of the truster. So if we now have a newer version of ChatGPT, we also have this cue indicating that ChatGPT can make mistakes, but it's a bit harder to detect. And it's even less specific. It just says ChatGPT can make mistakes. So this is like the detection point, but also to understand what is meant by the utilization. You could take this example from, it was an early literature research with ChatGPT, but it should help to demonstrate what I'm referring to. So after multiple incorrect references, I asked ChatGPT to how certain it is with respect to the last reference it gave me. And it said it was 100% sure that the last response was correct. But when I entered the reference, it didn't return any references. So it was, in fact, an irrelevant cue. And it is not surprising that a large language model is not capable of calibrated metacognitions, but still users have to know that this is kind of an irrelevant cue and they should not use it as in a conversation with a human partner. All right. So that was like let's come to the second proposition of the TRUM, which is that trustworthiness is a subjective concept. So, and to pay tribute to this inherent subjectivity of trustworthiness, the TRUM introduces individual standards. And individual standards, they cover kind of the truster's values and goals, and thereby they also determine the actual trustworthiness of the system. So to illustrate this, you could think of an AI system for therapy decisions, which is highly accurate and validated with a large representative data set. And still, this system might be more or less trustworthy for people with different optimization goals. So, for instance, for some people or some patients, it might be more important to minimize pain, and for others, it might be more important to maximize lifespan. And this also is inherent in the question how trustworthy a system is for those different patients. And to further clarify these individual standards, we could like think of an empty requirement list kind of at the beginning. So we have some standards that define what make a system trustworthy for us, or in this case, let's say for me, because often we cannot agree on those standards. But this is kind of an empty list. And then we could say that the actual trustworthiness of a system reflects how trustworthy the system is actually with respect to these, so to my individual standards. And this is kind of the same requirement list that is theoretically filled out with perfect knowledge. And the perceived trustworthiness, on the other hand, is like answering the question how trustworthy I think the system is with respect to my individual standards. And the degree to which those two requirement lists overlap, this indicates the accuracy of the trustworthiness assessment. So to conclude, it is important to note that, like, according to the trustworthiness assessment model, different perceptions of trustworthiness, like of different trusters, that they can stem from different individual standards because they just have different goals in mind, but they can also stem from varying cue detection and utilization, so that some trusters just didn't detect some cues or did interpret them in another way. Okay, that was kind of the micro level of the trustworthiness assessment. But the TRUM also makes a third proposition, and that these trustworthiness assessments are embedded in a social and societal context, and they do not happen in isolation. And that's why there's also like a zoomed out macro level perspective, where we would say like the trustworthiness assessment that I just described on the micro level, that this propagates for different trusters with different individual standards also, and therefore also different actual trustworthinesses. So we could think of like a developer assessing the trustworthiness of an AI system, then they give model cards to certification institutions, and they provide a seal, which is then used by deployers to assess the trustworthiness of this system. And then they promote a system within their company, and there are users which use these systems, and so on. So basically what we would say is that the perceived trustworthiness of one truster produces new cues for later trusters. And therefore, it is helpful to differentiate between two kinds of cues. So we have like primary cues that stem directly from the system, which could be any form of explanation or some information on the in the user interface. And also secondary cues that stem from other trusters. So this could be, for instance, the seal or a label, but it could also be the testimonials of colleagues that are more or less positive about a system, recommending the system or not. Okay, and that was kind of like our conceptual frame with which we try to make sense of trust and trustworthiness assessments. And we hoped to have built like a helpful lens to understand what's going on between users of AI systems. And therefore, we try to evaluate parts of the model in the field. And we also published this so I did this together with Fabian Lechner, Katja Werle, Berit Kreulich, Martin Hirsch, and Markus Langer. And you can also find this publication. But basically, we were inspired by these initial discussions and expectations of AI as a healthcare advisor. And what we aimed to understand was how humans reach their perceived trustworthiness of a system, so in our case, a virtual doctor. And we wanted to check whether the concepts of the TRUM are actually useful in application. So the research questions, so we aimed at kind of a theory elaboration, and our research questions were first, what are prevailing perceptions of virtual doctors? So we wanted to uncover the commonalities and differences in how people assess the overall trustworthiness of a virtual doctor. Then we wanted to understand what are the strategies that individuals employ to assess the trustworthiness of a virtual doctor. And we wanted to understand upon what specific factors individuals base their trustworthiness assessments. So we also wanted to identify the individual standards and which cues people use to check whether their standards are met. So basically, we only had like the writer part of this model, so we did not check the actual trustworthiness or how accurate their assessment was, but rather what cues they use and which standards they have. All right, and to reach these goals or to answer these questions, we took part at 2 outdoor exhibitions in Germany between April and October 2023. So it was quite at the beginning of like the large language model hype. Let's not put it as a hype, but yeah, the wave. And yeah, so basically we had this exhibition and there was this yellow phone booth where people could just walk in, pick up the phone and talk to a virtual doctor. And that virtual doctor was based on GPT-3, DaVinci 003, so it was like a very early version. So we were kind of very much at the forefront. So, and that one was just prompted to process and respond to healthcare-related questions. And after people or participants conducted their after their interaction with the virtual doctor, we conducted short, semi-structured interviews after their interaction with the virtual doctor. And we did this as a note-taking approach as we conducted the experiment in a public environment. So we did not record the interviews, but we had like 4 different interviews and we always conducted the interviews in pairs of 2 persons to validate the responses. So our sample, so we in total had 51 interviews, which durated between 5 and 20 minutes, and a total of 65 participants, because sometimes we had like groups or couples interviewed together with a mean age of like 44, and about half of the sample was female. To analyze our data, we conducted thematic analysis for theory elaboration after Brown and Clark, and we made a combination of inductive and deductive coding. We engaged in like an iterative coding to define the themes and subthemes and also to allocate the representative quotes. And then these themes and subthemes were validated by 4 scholars within and outside our research team. And also they had like varying degrees of familiarity with the trustworthiness assessment model, but also with trust research in general. So the results are like quite extensive, but I try to present like the most interesting from my perspective to you. So regarding the first question, we found that most people thought, so they considered the quality of the advice was good, but still their trust was more heterogeneous. So often they said that they would like kind of conditionally trust the system. So they said things like, I would use it if you're not seriously ill, or I would only trust it to a limited extent, or I would only use it if I just need a sick note, or if I don't want to go to the doctor unnecessarily. So what this showed us was like kind of that trust is not a mere function of ability, because the perceived quality was much better kind of than the trust in this virtual doctor. And also that most people did not have like a fixed trust attitude, but they are like looking for cues and trying to weigh the risks and benefits. And that also brings us kind of to the next research questions, to the question how we set these individual standards. And often participants specified their individual standards by an initial risk assessment. So they communicated that they weighed the gains and losses which they assume or expected to come along the use of the virtual doctor. So, and this also helped them to adjust their standards. So if they expected high risks, they also had higher standards. And if they only like imagined low risk application contexts, they also lowered their standards. Also, they used naive theories. So, for instance, some participants said that they expect the virtual doctor to work like Google, or a search engine. So they also expected it to be like as useful as Google would be. And what I thought was very interesting was like they often compared the virtual doctor to different benchmarks. And basically, we found that this comparison agent also defined their perceived trustworthiness. So to set their individual standards, participants used either like a technical benchmark or a human benchmark. And the result of this comparison with the virtual doctor and their benchmark, that influenced their participants' perceived trustworthiness. So to illustrate this, like some participants, so one participant said, so the virtual doctor is more specific than the internet and better than Googling. So it like they had a positive result of this comparison. Another person said, oh yeah, the Snapchat AI can tell me more. So then their trust was higher in another technical benchmark. And people who had like bad experience with their human doctor, like this person said, yes, indeed, you wait a long time at the doctors and they only take 2 to 3 minutes for you. And the AI is patient and always available. They like had a higher, they had a positive result for the virtual doctor. But another person said, okay, I'd rather call my family doctor. I live in the countryside and we know each other there. So basically it was a question of the alternative and how good the virtual doctor performed in comparison to this alternative. And what we also found was that individual standards differed. So participants hold different and partly even contrary individual standards. So for instance, regarding the virtual doctor's degree of autonomy, they said like, okay, so some people said, okay, the virtual doctor should not have autonomous consequential abilities because then the risk is too high, and they like put patient safety higher. And others said, well, if the virtual doctor does not operate more autonomously, why should I even use it? So they required basically a more autonomous agent. And what we also found is that there was a difference in the degree of detail or granularity in which standards were communicated. So, for instance, with respect to privacy, we found that some participants communicated very broad standards. So they just said like, okay, I don't want to be identifiable. And others were more specific. So that they wanted that their data should only be saved locally, only in text form, and it should be usable for research and development of the system. So there's just different knowledge bases that also influence like the degree of granularity of the standards. And what we also found was that the queue utilization differed. So some participants, they utilized different queues to validate the same standards. So for instance, to validate the technical functionality of the virtual doctor, some reported that they would use the system's database, and others said that they would rely on testimonials of their peers. And what we also found is that participants utilized the same queues, but differently. So as you might also have encountered, when you require some medical advice from a large language model, usually in the end it says, but you should, if you feel, if you don't feel well, you should seek advice from a human doctor. And that was also the case in the virtual doctor we have installed there. And this queue was like interpreted by some participants as like positive and that it is promoting high patient safety. And other said, okay, well, if it still sends me to a human doctor, then probably it lacks some ability to do the task by themselves. So that was quite heterogeneous. And also, we found that third parties were utilized to infer either the presence or the absence of trustworthiness. So some said like, okay, if my health insurance would provide this system, then I would use it. And others, like they said, I would never use it if my health insurance would provide the system. Some providers were more positive, like universities or clinics. And then there was also like kind of a red flag, which was quite homogeneously that if there was some kind of pharma industry involvement, that this would kind of exclude their use or trust in the system. Right. Of course, this is only like a first approach to understand the value of the model and also the perceptions of user perceptions of virtual doctors. And we have some limitations, like we conducted this study in a public environment, and our participants, they were not actually sick. They, of course, came up with some of their health concerns, but they were not like in a critical situation. The interviews we took were quite short, and we had this like note-taking approach. The design of the virtual doctor as a male physician dressed in a white cloak was also quite stereotypical. And we had a focus on a Western culture in our sample. But so to sum up, we think that this is still like first evidence that the trustworthiness assessment model is a useful lens to describe human AI interactions. We found that perceived trustworthiness of the virtual doctor and the trust in the virtual doctor differed, and that we could explain these differences partly by different individual standards and also by different detection and utilization of cues. And also we found that the macro level assumptions of the TRUM are kind of useful, as many participants said that they would like rely on the assessments of third parties, or like, for instance, peers or experts, instead of assessing the system trustworthiness for themselves. And I think it's like important to note that people need to be aware of the individual standards of those parties assessing the system, to avoid that like false assumptions or expectations are promoted. So Trump could be helpful, at least in describing trustworthiness assessments. But what can we also learn from this for trust research in HCI? So I think what it also shows is that we need to ask the question, what is the best that we can aim for? So I think a lot of people interested in trust research come across calibrated trust or trust calibration, or however, or appropriate reliance, whatever the name is you choose. But when looking at the trustworthiness assessment model, you see that there's a difference between an accurate assessment and a justified assessment. So we need to define how accurate an assessment can really be when we look at like large language models or other forms of AI. And also whether it's like a justified assessment. So whether the truster, given the available cues, came to a justified assessment, even if it's not correct. And then this could also help us to identify like which cues we need to have, or which cues need to be clarified, or what just is the expectation on a truster. Yeah, a next thing that I thought might be interesting for researchers is to look for homogeneous cues. Like when we provide information in form of cues, like that should indicate the trustworthiness of the system, we need to check how homogeneously they are used, or whether there is some kind of like heterogeneity in the interpretation. So it should be very clear, and there should not be much variation in users' interpretation of a specific cue. And I think that could be helpful also to check whether cues are used as they were intended by the designer. And of course, I think also that it is important to check for competing individual standards, because only then we do know whether it's a problem of the cue or system design, or whether it's just an wanted or unwanted difference in individual standards. And probably it's okay to have different individual standards, and then we might need to find transparent ways of communicating system standards to the users. And otherwise, we might need to think about ways of like training, or interacting with the user to adapt these individual standards in different ways. Yeah, I think this is it from like my side, from my references. And I thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nadine. That's really interesting views and very nice work. I definitely have a set of questions I'd like to discuss with you, but I'll look around first to see if there are anyone else here in the audience who'd like to jump in with a question. But perhaps I can set the ball rolling nonetheless while everyone gathers their thoughts. I particularly enjoyed your reflection on the nature of cues that one could try to construct and offer to end users in order to bring about, let's say, more meaningful interaction with systems, as you said, there's widespread terminology that one could slap onto that context, whether it's appropriate reliance or meaningful interaction with systems or what have you. But I was wondering about your thoughts around how these cues can also lead to widespread AI adoption, right? I particularly liked your interpretation, and within the tram model, I enjoyed the fact that there was separation of concerns in some ways when you talk about the micro level and the macro level, and how sometimes the micro level can then go on to influence interactions at the macro level. Right? I particularly enjoy that. And I was wondering whether you've thought about the next step. In some ways, I guess you have, because you're talking about interacting with the system and whether or not the users are capable of forming trust in a meaningful way in a system. And then there you have the cues. But have you also thought about how cues in general, both at this micro and macro level, can go on to have a larger impact on, say, the adoption of a particular AI system or of a given piece of technology at the macro level, right, at the societal level? ChatGPT being an example at scale, not just was it accessible to the masses, but the lack of appropriate trustworthiness cues or cues that could be meaningful may have led to what we've seen over the recent past, right? I'd love to understand your thoughts around this.
Yes, yeah, I think I shortly touched on seals or labels. I think they could have an important role in this. So, but I think that's not enough. So as I said, like I'm in a medical context and it's a very vulnerable context, and like physicians have like a high professional identity. So when they start working as a physician, they swear an oath on like putting humanity first and putting patient well-being first. And I think that's also why some of our participants said that they would entrust a university clinic or some kind of clinic to provide a system, because they take kind of the responsibility for the system. And I think that this is also important, that there's some kind of responsibility and also some kind of like acknowledging the responsibility that AI systems may have in this. So in my case, like a medical context or a medical environment. So, and I think that there's some person standing up to a specific set of values that is important, because there is a difference between Grok being out there doing whatever is possible, and that is not what medicine is like. That is not the mindset in medicine. So you cannot just figure things out on the run. So yeah, I think that is important. So that is where we are now, like heading in this direction of like how could we manifest some appropriate trust measurements there.
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, we do have ChatGPT Health nowadays, and we could talk about the implications of that at length. But no, I think what you're saying makes sense, and often there's this I think notion of attaching trust in institutions that goes a long way towards shaping some of these interactions. I can imagine that regulatory efforts are also quite important in that sense, right? We've seen this happen across different fields where there's been some evolution in technology, whether it's the food industry or medical device industry, right? Indeed, I think there is some room for regulation. In fact, some of our own efforts here to try and understand AI adoption in general has looked at information asymmetry, right? So quite often there might be organizations that are behind the creation of the AI system in play, who might have more information at their disposal to offer in terms of saying transparency or other details that can help people make better judgments and inform their trust calibration in some ways, but they don't do this because either this is against their revenue making process, right, or it's a business secret or what have you. And I think your work and with respect to trying to externalize these cues appeals towards more transparency in that sense, and that makes a lot of sense to me. Just looking at my notes, but again, asking around if there are more questions from others. Feel free to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'll be happy to go on to my next one. There's a lot of interesting stuff that Nadine covered grounds on, and I'd like to unpack some of it. All right, asking twice, and okay, it's my turn to go again. Nadine, so I was also intrigued by what you said about how justified assessment could be, I think, without putting words in your mouth, what I understood was your assertion that justified trust could be useful even, if it's not necessarily the right assessment, so to speak, right? And I was wondering whether justified assessment from the point of view of a truster can probably reflect diligence. I think that's what you were sort of hinting at. Or did this person really consider meaningful reasons to trust a system? And that can sure signify diligence. But I was also wondering how this doesn't guarantee much, right? It doesn't necessarily safeguard one from, say, or guardrail one from outcomes. And is that an issue, right? So I think I agree that it's better to consider things critically and still not arrive at a meaningful calibration than to not do that at all. But what's the next immediate step, and how exactly can we help with ensuring that there are justified ways of calibrating one's trust?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So I think so. I know that you also touch on human oversight, and basically human oversight is concerned with the question, when should users trust and when should they intervene? And what I think is important to ask is, when do we consider human oversight fulfilled? When is it correct? So we cannot expect users to know everything, because that is just, yeah, that's not rational and that's not possible. That's just not where we come from. We all make mistakes, and often systems are used because there are mistakes. So basically, we cannot expect perfect performance from a human. And if we would have perfect performance, then usually we would not probably use a system that is still supervised. So we have high risk. We don't have perfect knowledge. So, and then I think we need to have some kind of this kind of in defense of a physician using an AI system. Because if there's an error, how should they take responsibility when they did everything right? So the person was within the realm of the data that the system is trained on. So everything is say on the books, but still the outcome is wrong. So I thought that is a very uncomfortable situation, which physicians are in when they need to, or when they want to use an AI system. And I thought it is important to make this distinction, because if we want that trusters only use the system when it's right, then there needs to be a very clear way of validating whether this is correct, whether this is I did some research on heart sound diagnosis. So physicians listen to the heart sounds with a stethoscope. So that is often not a clear-cut case. AI systems can help, but still they won't reach 100% accuracy, right? So, but if it's so, it is very hard in a case-by-case observation to decide when it's okay to use the system. Yeah, so I think that is why I wanted to underline or highlight that there is really a difference. And if we want that it's always right, we need to provide the information that allows them to be always right. Because if we do not, then it's just, I think it's unfair, or there needs to be some kind of responsibility shift at this point. So yeah, that was just where I wanted to pinpoint, kind of. Yeah. Does it make
Sure,
sense?
thanks. Yeah, I think so. And I think maybe in contexts like these, right, I fully empathize the complexity when we try to embed stochastic systems in decision-making processes, right? And where we try to attribute accountability, and then yet we say the accountability of this lies with the humans who are using such systems. And I think that's the leap while we're moving from the more predictable systems towards the more unpredictable, uncertain, stochastic systems that characterize generative AI based or generative AI powered solutions, right? So I fully embrace that. I think something that can be operationalized, but it's quite difficult to do so, is this notion of verifiability over there, right? If there is a way to help users in such contexts, such as the one you described, to come up with a means to verify whether or not some proposed advice or a suggestion or a decision is likely to be correct or wrong, right? Not just in the build up to the advice, right? So we've seen a family of approaches being proposed over the last few years, and how can we help people make better decisions and while relying on AI systems, right? To prevent under-reliance and over-reliance and all of that. But there's also this, I think, less operationalized goal of verifiability, which is, can I help an individual quickly or in some meaningful way? Maybe it probably doesn't have to be quick, right? But in some meaningful way, verify whether some advice is correct in some sense or not, right? And there's some amount of work in that area. I'm aware of folks from University of Washington who've done some work there, but I can also imagine that there are challenges in making that happen, right? How exactly can you create a verifiable facet out of a decision aid that's supporting some given context, right?
Also, like, maybe I can just step in here because I think expectations, especially in Germany, on AI in like saving the healthcare system and helping with the demographic changes and the challenges our healthcare system faces, there are high expectations. And if we want to like realize these efficiency gains that are expected, I'm not saying we should or whatever, but if then there's no way of controlling everything, because then I think often you won't have like this. Yeah, so let's say the time you must not spend on a task is equalized when you have to control every output of a system. So I think there's like a tension, and we need to find ways how we deal with this tension of like large efficiency gains, and at the same time we lose control at some point.
Right.
We need to find out how much control we are fine to lose. But I think there needs kind of like, yeah, I don't know, a checklist or some kind of structured process at which instances there needs to be a validation or like something structured that yeah, in our case, I often think about physicians, but some users need to follow to, yeah, use AI in a responsible but still effective way. Yeah, and I think that's why we talk so much about trust at all. I mean, if we have like full control and a perfect system, this discussion would be resolved, and I would be more than happy to know that there is no trust issue after all. But yeah, we're not there yet, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think your point on trade-offs is a good one. And indeed, I don't think the conversation has to remain restricted to efficiency gains or, what that gain in time can be put to good use for, right? But I think it could also be a broader conversation. And indeed, I think trade-offs are certainly something to factor in. Maybe I can move the conversation towards your discussion around some of the individual standards that you discovered, right? And I found that quite interesting. And I was wondering whether in your work you considered modeling or thinking about these individual standards as potential dynamic standards, right? I can imagine that individuals probably have standards that continuously evolve. And maybe before you take that question, did you come across individuals who failed to articulate their standard at all? Because I can imagine that in the real world, this doesn't necessarily need to pan out in a seamless fashion. There might be arbitrary things and arbitrary reasons why people rely on systems.
Yes. So the first question, the dynamic standards, I think that's totally true. And I think so that is my conceptual idea of how trust evolves, is like that there is, like, as I said, most of the participants, they were like indecisive. They said, yeah, well, I need to look how risky the situation is, what is the system. So basically they are open to process cues and information, and then they form their perceived trustworthiness. So I think this is very dynamic, and also like the point with the benchmark, that is like so often. So I was really surprised by that, because I thought, I mean, it was very at the beginning of large language models, and they were not that good, right? So I thought no one would trust it at all. But basically, we noticed that people were like, well, the alternative is so bad, I don't get an appointment with any physician. So yes, I would use it. So, and I think the lower the alternative is, so if the standards are like so low, then the alternative, the AI alternative becomes more attractive. So yes, I think that is dynamic. And to your second question, also yes, we also had conversations where we did not get a lot of like reflection on what are the standards and what do we even expect of them, like, and we try to get to this in a conversation, but they were like, just, I don't know, I just don't trust it. So we also described this a bit in the paper. And I think this is also something that is very important, because like when we face, so I'm sorry that I'm always like in this medical context, but if patients go to their physicians, they don't need to check their individual standards, because they are checked. They know they have these high ethical standards. They know there's a high regulation. They know they have like high ability standards. So they need to like learn for 6 or 7 years, and then they have an education going on for 5 more years. And so there is no need for every patient to check the to reflect on the standards of the human physician. So this can be wrong at some instances, but in general, you could say, okay, they can trust the process, because they don't need to verify a model's trustworthiness, kind of. Yeah, so now I need to get back to the original question. Yeah, so, and I think that this is something that we now need to promote, that we need to be aware that humans might know that we might disagree and that there might be different standards and we can communicate them. But that this is not like the case in conversational system, although they seem so conversational, and probably they might ask, but also they might not. So there's not this, like the interpersonal way, okay, we're on the same wavelengths. I don't know whether you could say this, but
Right.
yeah. So this is something new that we need to learn, and I think it's also important to try to highlight what could be different individual standards, and probably they are not explicit, and I think often they are not explicit. But when faced with the situation where the question is, okay, do you want to have less pain or do you want to live longer, then that's even not easy, but it's both of the options are valid. So it's not like a question of right or wrong, and no regulation ever could make this decision for you. Okay.
Right. No, that's definitely a valid point. With an eye on the clock and not to keep you here beyond the hour we promised, maybe one last question from me. And I was wondering what you'd believe are the implications of having these different. Oh, and I see Victoria has a question too. And I don't know if you need to run,
But
Nadine.
go
No,
ahead.
that's
No, I
fine.
don't.
That's fine.
All
You
right.
can go
Okay,
ahead with
then
yours.
sure. And then we'll try and squeeze in the other one as well if Nadine graces us with some extra time. Yeah, so I was wondering whether, or what your thoughts are rather, on the implications of individuals having these varying standards, and I wonder whether you connect it to AI literacy as well, right? So is the answer to this dilemma surrounding these varying and dynamic individual standards also somewhere in the ballpark of AI literacy?
Yes, partly, of course. I mean, I think there's a responsibility of like systems to disclose their standards if they are like consistent. So I think if this, I mean, we need to distinguish between the systems, but I think it's very important in terms of AI literacy to know that probably this is a question you need to ask. So yeah, I think that's just very important that that we should not assume too much implicit agreement in this regard. Yeah.
And do you think there's, or maybe, with the folk theories, I'm calling them folk theories, but they're, sort of individual standards, as you've put it, with respect to how people decide to trust or not trust the system. Is there any, key interesting detail you'd like to walk away with to inspire others who are listening in onto this talk about a potential direction to run forward with, right? So is there something interesting about this diversity in folk theories or individual standards that you can cast as an important next question?
Oh,
If there isn't one, that's perfectly
I don't
fine. And
think
there are
so
probably
that
many.
you have
Yeah,
something that is totally new. So I think it's more of that what we know that
right.
probably people might adopt things they already know and just put their conception on these systems. Like I think the comparison between the search engine and language model, that also comes naturally when we use a search engine, there's automatically an AI response. So this is kind of like nudged by the providers. I think that is a problem, to be honest. Maybe they should be more transparent, but yeah, I don't know. Like I think that is not like, maybe this is also a wanted response. Like they just think you could just also likewise use a search engine or an AI bot. So yeah, probably that's also part of the AI literacy. But somehow also in the responsibilities of system designers.
Fair. Thank you, Nadine. And Victoria, your question?
Yes. Okay. So it's partially a question and partially just a thought I had during your talk. So trustworthiness is one thing, but I thought trustworthiness does not equal behavior necessarily, because I guess I could find the system not really trustworthy, but still, because as you mentioned, since it's more accessible or it takes less effort to get to the answer, I might still prefer it to other solutions. And um, I guess, especially also in a kind of like controlled research setting, there's also some kind of limitation. So when you're explicitly asked if you find the system trustworthy and if you would use it for task X, Y, Z, you might answer differently than you would actually do in a real life setting. So yeah, I don't know. I was wondering, it also goes a bit in the direction of a question from earlier in terms of AI literacy. And I guess there are just multiple factors that influence that, but I don't know. I don't know. I can only talk for myself, even though I would consider myself um, somewhat AI literate. Um, just efficiency or time constraints or whatever in some situations do make me gravitate towards the quicker, not so trustworthy LLM answer.
Yes, so thank you very much for the question. I think I know in which direction you're heading, and I think this is also something that I should kind of make clear that, of course, not every interaction is based on a cognitive like interaction, and that this is not our usual mode of thinking, but and also like that this is not the only driving motivator for our behavior. And I think it's very important to have this whole process in mind. I don't know whether this is, yeah, I think this should help to illustrate this, because like there's like things that happen after the trustworthiness assessment. But I think also like you could use any cue, and basically it could be also very emotional assessment. So if it's just like, oh, this has a nice user interface and basically that's all I need, then it's not like a very thought through rational decision that happens here. It probably appears like this, but it's not like meant this way. It could also be very fast, this process. And then I think you're right. It could be just like, let's say, time pressure that pushes you to use a system. And probably that's then we need to understand the whole process of how this behavior is influenced. But what I also think is that we, even when we have time, and even when we like try to really reflect what we think about a system, that there is also uncertainty in this process. And there could also be errors or misconceptions, or as I said, like you could just have a different goal. And just, I think like having a prototype of something is completely different of like having something in a running in a high risk situation. And if two people meet with these different goals in mind, and of course there might be just different approaches and more or less trust in any output. So, and I think this is like important to have the whole process in mind, but that this trustworthiness assessment is also part of this process. And if there's something wrong, like, or something misaligned between trusters in a system, or in the cue detection or utilization, it just helps to avoid the avoidable. Of course, that's not all we have. It's more like one part of the puzzle. And yeah, it's not one answer to all the questions that how we could predict how people behave, but yeah, it could be one aspect of an initial assessment. So I think it's good to have the whole process in mind, and that the trustworthiness assessment is like one part that is added to the model. It should not replace what was already there. I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. Um, one more thing I was wondering, so in terms of cues, so did I get it correctly that especially for the micro level cues, these are more kind of like implicit cues that are kind of like just derived from the model behavior?
So the cues are, what do you mean with implicit
Like
cues?
in the sense of, is this just so? Is micro level what I derive from the behavior and the answers of the model, and macro level more like dependent on external stances on the or like external assessments of the model from
Okay,
external parties?
yeah, I guess I call it like primary and secondary cues. Like the primary cues are basically directly related to the system, so they stem from the system. This could be behavior of the system. This could be information from the system on the interface, or some kind of like model card about like, okay, I don't know, the data that is provided with the system. And secondary cues are more, okay, your colleague uses the system and says it's working fine, or there is a seal saying that this is a trustworthy system, or your employer integrates a system in your workflow. And this kind of is a cue. So you would not expect them to implement a system like that is not trustworthy at all from their perspective. So these are all secondary cues that we refer to here.
Okay, so now that that's clarified for me, so my question is, what kind of cues, or are there some kind of cues that we could intentionally induce in these kinds of systems to help the user assess the trustworthiness?
Of course, I mean, often so any designer of a system should like decide which cues are most relevant to the actual trustworthiness of the system. So I think transparency or explainability could be means to like providing or promoting accurate trustworthiness assessments. But of course, there are also other cues that may promote trust, but not accurate trustworthiness assessments, like the anthropomorphization of a system or something like that, which often leads to higher trust, but it doesn't tell you much about the actual trustworthiness of a system. And I think also like the seals, if you have like a proper communication of the standards of a specific seal or certificate, then this could also help or make it easier for users to say, okay, I use these systems because I know I agree with these standards of the certification institution. So it's like, it's how we, so I don't know, decide to buy biological products or fair trade products. And then we might find out that the standards are not how we thought. And then at some point we need to renegotiate the standards of these seals, and there will be new seals. So I think this is, yeah, we can build on what's already there in other areas.
Yeah, makes sense. All right. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Nadine, for not just sharing all of these inspiring thoughts, but also for being very patient and graceful with your time. We did squeeze in a few more questions. Appreciate you sticking around. Yeah, so it was wonderful listening in and learning more about your work. And have a wonderful evening in Marburg.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for the thoughtful discussions and questions. I'm looking forward to see each one, each of you at some point. Maybe our paths may cross. So I'm looking forward. Thank you.
Definitely. I think it's a small word. Small world. Thanks again. And also for everyone else who joined in right now, I appreciate you being here. And for those who will circle back to catch this later on our webpage, we welcome you too. Do join us for the next staff talk on Monday next week. This, of course, is the 5th edition of the Academic Fringe Festival. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.